Hollywood and Sip. I am your host, Kat Smith, and with me today I have the authors of Nothing But a Good Time, the uncensored history of the 80s hard rock explosion, and it was very hard for me not to sing the title. Um, we are with authors Tom Beaujeur and Richard Beanstalk, and why don't you both just give a little hi?
Hey, how's it
Kat. Thanks
going?
for
Thank you
having
for
us.
having us.
I always should pick one of you to speak first. How about Tom? Why don't you give us an overview of the book, and then Richard, I'll have you come in and tell us how the writing of it came about.
So the book is an oral history, which means that it's like all quotes from actually the people versus prose. And it basically, what we tried to do is we span the entire glam metal or hair metal, however you want to call it, era, which basically starts in the very late 70s with bands like Quiet Riot and actually Van Halen right before them, and then goes up till when you can use it as an easy point of to use it as grunge sort of ends the era, or that new wave of bands comes in. So it's really that whole decade told by the artists, managers, costume designers, producers. We spoke to over 200 people.
And Rich, how did it come about?
It came about, Tom and I have known each other and been colleagues for about 25 years. We worked at Guitar World magazine together for a long time. And even back in those days, this is going back more than a decade, we've talked about the idea of doing a book like this because this is the music that we both grew up on. This is the music that we both still love, you know, in addition to other musics, but we both still just have an immense like appreciation for this stuff. And so it was something that we were always talking about and like, you know, check out this, check out that, or like just some whatever minutia that we had heard about that sort of blew our minds. So it was like this constant conversation. And I think we put off doing it because we both knew we would dive in so deeply if we ever actually did take it on, that we were a little bit like wary of doing that. But eventually we just decided about 4 years ago, I think it was, let's do it. And that was pretty much when we started reaching out to people for interviews. It was about 4 years ago.
And that just reminded me of a quote that I wrote down from the introduction. This book, which at times seemed more like an unruly beast about to turn on its masters and engulf them in flames than a mere collection of inert words on a page, is complete. Looking at those pages and pages of people that you interviewed and thanked at the beginning, I was thinking, I mean, you easily could have never finished this book.
We almost didn't finish the book. I mean, no, there was definitely a point about a year and a half ago where we kind of like where we both kind of hit a wall. It was a lot of work, you know, like it was, we did a whole bunch of interviews, and then we at some point realized, wow, we've done a lot of work and we have a lot more to do. Cause you know, the nature of this kind of book is, since it's all quotes, for everything story you want to tell, you need like 3 or 4 people to be there and give you different viewpoints of the same story. So yeah, there were a couple moments where we were nervous. And then when we handed in the book, we were like 30% over our contracted length. And so we just like hit send on the manuscript and like both climbed under our respective desks, like, and tucked our, you know, heads under our hands, hoping that our editor wasn't going to email back and be like, this is great. Okay, now cut a third of it. Cause like we couldn't have done it. Like there's no way. We made it as tight as we could. So it was there. Yeah, there were times where it felt like the book was like definitely taking over everything.
You know, what's interesting about that is I wasn't going to ask you this question because I thought I had figured it out, but I don't think I have. There's obvious places where it's an interview where it's the one-on-one interview. I started out thinking that you had just quotes from all of your interviews that you're kind of quilting together in each chapter. And then I started to wonder, well, no, is this like a group interview where that whole group of people is together? So which is it? Because what you just told me again is that I don't know.
It was all individual interviews that were then put together. But I mean, clearly it was all, you would talk to somebody and then you would sort of follow up with the next person. And not meaning that was your next interview, that might be your interview 6 months later or a year later. But these threads started to emerge where we had an idea of the overall story we wanted to tell, but especially as other stories pop up in interviews, then you start pursuing those threads. And then the next person you talk to that you know was there at that time, you start asking them about that story and so on. And then maybe you go back to the first person. So they're all individual interviews, pretty much all done for the book though. And just kind of putting them together later on, and sometimes like a year or two later on, to try to tell a coherent story in that chapter, and then also have it bring you to the next part of the story.
And
go
oh,
ahead.
no, sorry, just to like, yeah. So what we did is we did like, you know, it follows there's about 10 different, maybe a dozen threads in the book that move through time. So what we did was, to further answer your question, we basically got all the interviews done. We wrote the different threads by quilting the stuff together, and then we took the 12 big things, and Rich and I literally sat there for like 3 days at his house figuring out how to cut them up so that the stories hand off to each other in a way that makes sense. And so we cut these long stories into short bite-sized chapters, and that was a task.
And ultimately you did a good job, because to me it felt like I was in the conversation. So that was part of why I couldn't figure out, well, did they quilt these together or are they talking together? So I mean, ultimately it works.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know that these guys could have been that open if they were all on the phone together, right, too, because they're giving their viewpoints on something that happened that sometimes involves these other people, you know.
And then I'm gonna go Tom and then Rich, just because that's the order you are on my screen. Was there one standout interview for each of you, either where you were starstruck or where you couldn't believe you were talking to the person, or where it was just like, this is a moment for me. I'm having a moment right now.
I had many moments, because this was really going through the list of everyone I wanted to hang out with when I was 15, you know. But for me, the real like super geek out was Vito Bratta, who is the guitar player in the band White Lion, because he's done 2 interviews in the last 20 years.
Oh, wow.
And he just doesn't do interviews. And he totally, like, when White Lion was done in 1990, that was it. Like he just disappeared. You know, he went back home to Staten Island, never did another record, never did. And I've always thought that band, you know, that his playing in that band, which is just incredibly melodic and clever, and as a guitar player, I always really aspired to it. And so I'd always wanted to talk to him. And then, you know, what was a great and pleasant surprise, and I think Rich will corroborate, is that we got to talk to these people. Like I finally get on the phone with Vito, and he's awesome. You know, and like that was usually the case. Like you get on the phone with this person who you idolize as a kid, and you like spend all this time reading interviews with them in Guitar Magazine, and then he's like the funniest dude, and he's telling you great stories about the early days, and, you know, hanging out with Twisted Sister, and the first time he saw Mike Tramp of White Lion backstage at a club in Brooklyn, and just like he's like, whoa, that guy was so good looking, it was unbelievable. Like, you know, and like he's just funny, you know. He's like, the girls were just melting, and he's got like this, like, so he was for me like the one where I was like, making this book is really fun. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, you know, I would say actually a lot of the most fun interviews were the people who their names you wouldn't necessarily recognize because they're behind the scenes guys. But as far as the artists, I loved talking to the guys in Skid Row, actually, and a few of them are guys I've spoken to in the past for other projects anyway. But their story is really great, and there's somebody else in the book who was there with them in the beginning and who's part of the story, and who talks about how the Skid Row guys, even back then, were just the funniest dudes to hang out with, like just jokesters and just a really good time. And that was what I got out of them, 40, 35 years later. Like they were all just super funny. They all were really energized in the way they told the story. And they all really, even though we were doing the interviews individually, they all really played off of each other in terms of the details. And I think because of that, it's one of the most sort of vivid stories, at least to me. Like it really just kind of pops off the page because these guys sort of make you feel like you're living it along with them and you're kind of along for the ride. And I think those types of stories in the book, I mean, the White Lion story is another one like that, like Tom was just talking about, where you really feel like you're following these guys from, from zero to hero, and you're along for that journey.
And I wrote down another line from the introduction, because as you were discussing, Nirvana kind of is where you can kind of see the end to the era. And you wrote, the hard rock and hair metal fan base never went away. It just got older, became gainfully employed, and spawned children that want to rock all night with them. I thought that was a really great way of summing it up, because the music didn't go anywhere. We still have it. People are still like blaring it out there. Their old school cars and their speakers. And what do you think the attraction is to, even though you can see the clear end, them making kind of a comeback now too?
I think it's finally, and we were lucky enough to talk to all of these artists like now, or in the last 4 years, at a time where it's become clear that this music is being embraced as like a new form of classic rock, and and that the people, and it's great for the bands and the people, like the people who are fans of the music have money to go to the shows and go on the cruises and do all that stuff and really interact with the bands, and the bands get to play again. And I think that people, carried these songs with them. You only get the music of your youth once. You're only going to connect. I mean, you can learn to appreciate other forms of music and love other records and this, that, the other thing, but there's only that one time in your life where you're young and like your brain is forming and everything's going on around you and your frontal lobes and whatever, and like that music you will carry with you for the rest of your life. And I think that people did, even though these bands sort of disappeared or were playing smaller clubs or weren't cool anymore, and maybe even people did for a while, like they were buying Pearl Jam records or whatever, but no, it doesn't matter. You're still carrying the music that entered you when you're 15 for the rest of your life. And I think that people are really embracing that, and because of the world we live in now, their kids are too. Like when you go and look at the numbers of plays of some of these videos on YouTube, like a Poison Nothing But a Good Time, and it's like 50 million. Like that's not just people from back then still watching them. There are whole new generations of kids and everyone in between discovering this stuff, and like this era when bands were superheroes and it looked like everybody was having fun and like this pyro and stuff. So I think it just like keeps activating new people's imagination as well.
Let's visit that. So in the 80s, I graduated 89. So I was a teenager in the 80s, and I lived in small town California.
Likewise.
So I didn't get out to places to see these, but I do remember the MTV videos and all, women rolling around on cars and all of that stuff. Where were you in the 80s? What was your life like for that generation?
I graduated from high school in '94, so I was a little younger, but I was listening to this stuff all through the 80s. I always tell people like the thing that really did it for me was Motley Crue's Looks to Kill video, which is 1983. So I was like 7 at the time, but even after seeing that, like it just impacted me in such a way where I was like full in for the rest of the 80s. But I guess to the point that you were just making about, you're watching these videos and there's women rolling around on cars, and the Looks to Kill video, there's women being herded into pens by men carrying torches, and dressed up like characters from Mad Max. But to my 7-year-old brain, like I didn't really compute any of that. Like I just saw the guys in the costumes and I heard the riffs and I was like, this is great. So a lot of that at the time, I guess, maybe passed me by, and I was solely focused on the music. But the music to me, you know, was so impactful. It was like it led me to start playing guitar because the musicianship was so incredible. And I think one of the things that was really appealing to me about this music, and that maybe has not been a part of music since, is that you had this incredible musicianship and this really over the top guitar playing, but then you also had these 3-minute pop songs. So you can kind of get all of it. And to me, that sort of total package is what really pulled me into the music.
And how about you, Tom?
I'm class of 89 too, so I'm right
Oh,
there
okay.
with you. I grew up in New York City, which was kind of a weird and great way to grow up because you just take the subway everywhere and your parents don't have to take you anywhere. So like I actually was lucky enough. I kind of listened to this music a lot, and as a guitar player was really attracted to it, and also had like I had cassettes that would have one of these bands on one side and then REM or the Replacements or Husker Du on the other. Like I was really just consuming a lot of different kinds of music. But I was lucky enough, being a couple of years older than Rich, like that Guns N' Roses show at the Ritz that was on MTV over and over. Like I was at that show. I
Oh,
won
cool.
the tickets to that. And got to see, Lynch Mob at the Cat Club, and I got to even see like Alice in Chains open for Extreme at the Cat Club. So I got to experience some of it in New York. Like it wasn't like being on the Strip, but I at least got to see some of the bands. And for me, it was very much watching all of this and watching Headbangers Ball. It was a way of setting myself apart in a school where a lot of people weren't into this stuff, but it was also just, it was like a real fantasy of like this. Look at these guys, like these are like, what could be better, seriously, than like running around on a giant stage with pyro and like flipping a guitar around your back and then like running across, and then there's the bass player and like you high five somewhere in the middle, and like the whole thing to me was just like, I'm like kind of getting worked up even talking about it right now. Like it was just like, that is the best way to live. It really was an aspirational thing. Like some people want to grow up and be like in the major leagues. I wanted to get on a stage and like run up an ego ramp and so it was just, it really just took over my imagination.
And speaking of the fantasy, I actually have another quote that goes with that. Blackie Lawless said, "Our foundation wasn't the theatrics. We didn't want to stand there and play. That wasn't us. Basically, it started out as entertainment for us. We quickly discovered that whenever you have the attention of eyes and ears, sight will always win over sound. People listen with their eyes, not their ears." And I thought that was an amazing way to sum it up, especially since in the introduction you kind of called it a rock and roll circus. I mean, these were full on productions. They weren't just the singer songwriter that we get a lot these days and the tame concerts. This was the explosions and the costumes and high heels and big hair and just all of the things.
Yeah, and I think Blackie has one perspective on it that I think sort of shows one side of it, which is he's a guy that was probably thinking about it a little bit more and like how what he was doing tied into the music and like the presentation and all that. But I think for a lot of these guys, it was like this was the music that they grew up loving, in the sense, meaning like Kiss and and those types of bands. So it made perfect sense to pursue that route when they were doing their own band. Like I don't know that they thought about the sound and the visuals as two separate things. Like it was all wrapped up in each other. So when they started presenting themselves as a band, it was in that same mind frame where it's like you have four guys that are going to look, of a piece, and they're going to be wearing costumes that work together, and that is going to be part of the music, really, in a way. Like it wasn't this separate thing. And I think that when they approached it on stage, that just extended to it as well, because even though they weren't like Kiss and playing Madison Square Garden, they were just starting out in their little local clubs or the Troubadour or the Whiskey or whatever. They went in there and acted like they were playing Madison Square Garden because that is what they were brought up on. So they just started out that way. And then when they actually got to that point where they were doing it, they had already been acting like they were doing it for, 3, 4, sometimes 5, 10 years in some cases. So it was a very easy transition for some of the bands.
And then I have a couple other stories I want to bring up before you go, because I think it's so fun to see the flip side of the fantasy, because the rock and roll circus was the fantasy, and we all saw that. And I think there's a tendency to think that all of them were partying all night, sleeping all day, performing, and then just recycling, right? But for example, one of the things I was surprised by was that Cinderella's Tom Kiefer worked for Photomat, which I don't know that a lot of people listening right now are going to remember Photomat, but that he would go to work at 6 a.m. and all day be driving this film around his deliveries, and then he'd go and rehearse all night. So I mean, there's a work ethic there that you don't think about. And then there's a quote from Bret Michaels that said they didn't necessarily want me because I was cool. They wanted me because I could. They didn't want me because I could sing. They wanted me because I owned a PA system. So you think about those fun origin stories where they're just in somebody's garage. I mean, he didn't go into it thinking I'm going to be Bret Michaels' Rock of Love. He went into it thinking I have a PA system, and now they invited me to join the band. So there's a lot of those stories in there, and I think a lot of people are gonna really enjoy hearing the background as well as the bigger than life fantasies.
Yeah, I mean, the work ethic and the drive is sort of like the sort of the theme that runs through the whole book. That behind, again, like exactly what you're saying, behind the pyro and the partying and all that stuff are like, people who worked harder at this than most people. And not to bring up the athlete comparison again, but it's really that level of like someone who wants to be a pro figure skater or something, certainly for the guitar players who gain that level of virtuosity. But yeah, Tom Kiefer, he's in a cover band, and suddenly he's like, you know what, I'm going to make it. And he spends a year refining songs and putting together a band and not even playing shows. Same with Skid Row. They're refining the same 12 songs for like, a couple of years. These people were very serious about what they were doing, and they didn't have a backup plan. And the ones who we write about in the book, the ones who made it, worked hard, probably harder than all the other people who didn't get the record deal. And I think there was a lot of competition, and to get to this level, there were no weak links. You had to have songs, you had to have everybody in the band looking good, you had to have moves, you had to have. So I think that it was a full package, and that there was a level of commitment and ambition that was necessary, that probably a lot of people got left by on the side of the road. We have some of those people in the book who just can't hack it. Maybe they're the more normal and well-adjusted people, but they're just not cut out for this world.
And then before I let you go, we talked about 80s versions of each of you. Why don't we really quick do kind of a nutshell resume where you are now, and we'll start with Rich this time.
Yeah, I do a lot of writing. I've written a few books over the last few years. Most recently, I did a book with the photographer Mark Weiss called The Decade That Rocked, which was more sort of a photo look at this era. I mean, Mark was one of the biggest photographers of the 80s. He did like the Twisted Sister Stay Hungry album cover. He did Slippery When Wet, Bon Jovi. Like, he was with all these guys basically throughout the whole decade. So we did that book together. I wrote the book for the Kurt Cobain movie that came out a few years ago, Montage of Heck. So there's an official companion book for that. So those were a few things. And then I've just been doing a lot of freelance writing otherwise for Rolling Stone and New York Times and Billboard, and a bunch of other places, as well as continuing with Guitar World.
And how about you, Tom?
I do some writing for like Guitar World and Guitar Player, sometimes Rolling Stone. And then, as you can see, I'm in a studio control room. I produce bands. I've worked with bands like Nada Surf, like a lot of quote unquote alternative rock bands, Nada Surf, Guided by Voices, Juliana Hatfield.
I love Juliana Hatfield.
Yes.
I've seen her concert 3 times.
I did 2 records. I did that Minor Alps record with her that she did with Matthew Cause of Nada Surf. I produced that, and I produced her record after that. So a lot of stuff like that. and writing, but the studio keeps me pretty busy. And then hopefully the two of us together will get to continue on this journey. We have been optioned for a documentary. Whether it gets made, that's a whole other, Hollywood is Hollywood. But I think it would be, I had a great time working with Rich on the book, so I think it'd be really fun if we got to actually dig into doing, a episodic version of this too. So that's hopefully this book keeps living, because we spent a lot of time, got a lot of time invested in it.
Awesome. And then if you guys do an indie film, you should consider submitting it to Sonoma Valley International Film Festival. Did I say that right? Sonoma International Film Festival. Sorry, there's no valley in it. Great festival. It's here in Sonoma where I am. We've been talking to the authors of Nothin But a Good Time, the uncensored history of the 80s hard rock explosion. And if you are listening right now on 91.3 FM KSBY Sonoma, the book comes out today. If you're seeing this later, then it's available everywhere and you should just go get it. So thank you guys so much for chatting with us today.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, and good luck with the book.
Thank you so much. See you later. Right. Stay safe.
Bye.
All right. Bye.